You guys see the presentation? All right. Yeah, so thanks, Frances, so much for the invitation. Yeah, I had met Frances before and worked with her as when you were a water quality monitor with the Friends of Deer Creek and Sierra Streams Institute, and very familiar with kind of the portions of the canyon that a lot of you guys live in and are kind of operating from. And yeah, I'm currently the executive director of Sierra Streams Institute. I've now kind of worked in multiple positions with SSI over the years. I came in first as an AmeriCorps member through the SNAP program, Sierra Nevada AmeriCorps Partnership, back in 2012. Then worked as an ecologist, helping with water quality monitoring and other forest management projects like that at Hirschman's Pond, which actually I think Shannon Hemke, our restoration ecologist, is also in the call that she then also took on as that was wrapping up. And then go off to grad school in forest ecology, and then came back to SSI as we went through a bit of a transition that we'll talk about in a second here. But was really pleased when Frances reached out to ask about potentially coming to talk about kind of forest resilience and forest health and what forest resilience and health mean in the context of these kind of landscape scale fires that we're seeing more and more. Because there's so much interest and so much investment, obviously, in our community in getting a lot of these stakeholder-driven projects off the ground. And it's really a unique opportunity for all of us to get on the same page and look at what's happening at that broader scale and how we can all kind of put those projects together. And then also how we can think about, when we think of forest health, fire is an integral part of forest health. And so thinking about what fire means to the forest, and then obviously the trade-off between fire and the forest in a healthy way, and what that means for us living in this wildland urban interface, and other components of forest health, and how those go into planning fuel reduction and kind of fuel abatement activities. So right off the bat, I want to say the title of the talk, Fuel Reduction, Burn Severity, and Resilience, What Works, What Doesn't, and What We Still Don't Know. That subtitle is, right off the bat, I have to point out, when we talk about science-driven or data-driven understanding of things, we're never going to be that definitive. So the goal of this talk isn't to say, hey, this works and this doesn't. It's to show some examples of why we think we know what we know, where we get those data sources from, what that data is telling us, and then how some of the recent shifts in fire behavior to some of these fires that are kind of breaking all of our rules of thumb have changed what we think we know about fuel severity or fuel reduction, burn severity, and resilience, and how we can integrate that in planning moving forward. So let's see if this moves forward. There we go. I want to start off with a brief acknowledgement of Nisenan people and how all the research that we're doing is on their historical lands. And this is both an acknowledgement of them as they seek federal recognition, but also really relevant to this discussion here, because we, at this point, have a pretty good understanding, or at least a rough idea, of the sheer volume and significance of their prior inhabitation of this land has had on forest health. So we know that going back about 12,000 years now, indigenous people lived on the lands of California and managed it in various ways, including through cultural burning. We're still not entirely clear on the scale at which some of that burning occurred, but we are pretty clear on frequency. Talk about every year, every 2 years, burning woodlands to increase oak sprout, to increase access to food sources, to increase forage for deer and other wildlife. And we know that that happened pretty universally across most of the Sierra. So that's going to feed into a lot of our discussion later too, about what we think historical fire regimes were in the Sierra Nevada. So starting off, this image is from a research plot down in the Southern Sierra in Sierra National Forest. This is a drone photo looking down at a mortality plot, and just want to show right off the bat when we talk about forest health, this is going to be in the context of fire. What are some other drivers of forest health under the considerations? This image, every tree that you see that has brown foliage is a ponderosa pine. And all pine trees, all conifers for that matter, that we have in California, so trees that produce cones, are evergreen. So if they are all brown, no green foliage, they are effectively dead, no longer photosynthesizing. And then all of the trees that are green around these ponderosa pines are cedar, white fir, oak, some shrubby species. And this is important to consider because this is related to the 2012 through 16 severe drought that we had across California that led to a lot of areas experiencing what we call type conversion, which is where we have a loss of the kind of dominant overstory species and a new species assemblage is taking over. And this is all connected back to fire because we, at least at this point, think the data points to things like fir and cedar and these other species. They grow up in the shade of the pines because they're shade tolerant. And if we had historical fire burning through at the rate we think it used to come through, it would clear out a lot of these understory species and allow more pine to resprout. This didn't happen in this plot. So when you get things like drought and bark beetle, then you have this fire intolerant, shade tolerant species coming in and taking over. And then this also then leads to this fear of, well, now we have a bunch of dry fuel. So it circles back to fire fears because, you know, all of these dead trees, unless they're salvaged pretty quickly, which isn't happening at the scale that, you know, maybe some timber harvesters had wanted, or is not happening at a scale that can really keep up with the sheer volume of mortality that occurred, then you have a lot of standing dead dry fuel in the landscape and can lead to some pretty high severity fires. These two pictures are taken from fires from this year. The top left is actually from the Dixie Fire. I find it to be, you know, both a kind of fear-inducing photo, but also kind of an eerily beautiful photo. But what stands out about this is this type of fire behavior, this kind of extreme pyrocumulus cloud forming, we call it head run fire behavior at the scale that we saw it this year, are really kind of exceeding our expectations of what we think fire should do on certain portions of the landscape. This is driven oftentimes by fuel moisture. And if we have a lot of dead fuel in the landscape, then that can increase that severity. We'll come back to that in a little bit. But then also on the bottom right, we have the Caldor fire. And this one's an interesting one to me from a more forest ecology perspective, because it's gotten a lot of press, a lot of media attention, and a lot of that attention has been focusing on some of the high severity locations, you know, Grizzly Flat, up over Echo Summit, some areas that got really burned out, and there was a lot of structure loss. And that is, you know, not something that we want or should, you know, be okay with in our communities. But when I see a photo like this, actually taken down by Christmas Valley, this is a little bit high severity than I'm usually, you know, looking at as a good fire. But overall, this fire is not a terrible fire. All the trees in front of you, the tall conifers, are healthy and not burning. There's a couple of torching trees in the back. We expect a couple of torching trees in moderate severity fire. So I hope coming back later in the talk, we can view, you know, an image like this for what it's worth ecologically, as well as how we then defend our homes against fire coming through by trying to get the forest to this kind of state so that when a fire burns through, we can kind of just let it harmlessly burn through and do its thing. Before doing that, I want to jump back really quick into what Francis said and kind of why I really wanted to come talk to you guys about the project that you're working on, is really our history within the Deer Creek Canyon overall. So Sierra Streams Institute started in 1995 as the Friends of Deer Creek. Actually, they weren't even called Friends of Deer Creek yet at that time, but some volunteers got together to monitor Deer Creek up and downstream of the Pine Street Bridge as it was being reconstructed. For concerns of contamination. It was built right immediately adjacent to an old abandoned mine site. So there's a lot of concerns about making sure that we were monitoring that water quality. Through that process, John Vanderveen, the founding chemist, and some others then became incorporated as a nonprofit and really focused on monitoring Deer Creek across its entire, across the entire watershed, using entirely volunteer teams. So it's interested community members that get trained, come out and use our instrumentation, and monitor water quality across the whole watershed, including up and downstream of where you guys are looking at building your fuel break. Then around 2003 and through 2010, we went through a bit of a restructuring process and looked at expanding out all of our programs into what we are today as Sierra Streams Institute. This includes things like our continued monthly water quality monitoring, bioassessments that follow a state protocol. We share data with the state and work with them on looking at stream health, habitat restoration, health impacts and remediation of mining contaminants. We do identification of all the macroinvertebrates in the stream, which tells us a lot about stream health, and then forest health research and management plans. And all of this takes place, like I said, across the entire watershed. So we actually have monitoring sites just upstream of where you guys are looking at working, and that's site 4 in the center there. The yellow area is Nevada City, so kind of right here. And then site 5 is down at the Bitney Springs Bridge, Bitney Springs Crossing. So we actually have sites upstream and downstream where you guys are looking, which could be a cool starting point also to dig into some of the data to look at what's the health of that section of stream. And then once you start doing treatments, how does that then influence water quality? And we have some good sample points to base that off of. So then now bouncing back to forest health and fire, you know, really one of the terms that's tossed around a lot these days that we really need to define first is resilience. So resilience is more than just resistance to a stress. It's actually resistance and recovery. And so my background is working in drought response of forests and drought resilience. So this was one of the first figures in which I was exposed to a kind of quantifiable version of resilience. And in this figure, the vertical axis here is a trait value. So if it's a tree, let's say it's a tree being exposed to drought, we can imagine this line is growth. So if it's higher up on this axis, there's more growth in a tree. It's just growing along through time, and then a stress is applied. Let's say it's drought, or it could be fire. The growth of that tree then dips in response to that stress. The level of dip that it experiences is inverse to its resistance. So if it declines a lot, it's not very resistant. If it declines a little bit, it's pretty resistant. Oftentimes we like to use the terms resilience and resistance interchangeably, but resilience actually then looks at what happens after that. So the tree, stopped growing as well. Maybe it even looked like it almost died. Maybe it lost some needles. But then after the drought, we get a couple of good wet years. Then maybe the tree responds by increasing growth back to a level pretty close to where it was before. Resilience is then the ratio of the recovery of the growth to the resistance, which is the declining growth. But that ratio can be different and lead to a different resilience that kind of is counter to our interpretation of how resistant something is to stress. So this one on the left is really resistant to stress. So it didn't decline in growth as much as this tree on the right, but the tree on the right recovered more effectively. So actually the tree on the right is more resilient. And this is a really important consideration when we talk about field treatment and forest health. When we're referring to fire resilience, we're not just saying, can it take a fire and resist it? We're saying, can it a little bit resist the fire, but then also recover after to a state of ecological health that's at least on par with what it was before, or potentially even better. And so that then brings us to other concepts of forest health that are going to kind of guide some of this discussion. And really forest health is a complex thing to define. So there's multiple ways to look at it. We can talk about things like diversity in the forest. We can talk about resilience like we just did. And another thing to consider is what we call ecosystem services. So this is going to be a brief, maybe reintroduction for some people, but then also just a couple of things to consider again for field treatments moving forward. Ecosystem services are what we look at in terms of an ecosystem being able to provide something either for us, for wildlife, providing some sort of downstream, literally and figuratively, benefit to other things. They're often broken down into, for example, provisioning, regulating, supporting, and cultural services. These are basically provisioning is provisions, timber, grazing land, stuff, resources. Regulating services are things like water filtration, water storage, soil conservation and development. Supporting services are things like nutrient cycling, like carbon storage. Forests are taking in carbon and storing it in the wood. If that wood is then removed and turned into some sort of wood product at certain scales, you're locking that carbon away while then growing new trees to bring in more carbon. Cultural services would be things like aesthetic values, stress relief, spiritual well-being. Those are all actual measurable values of ecosystems. This is just an example of kind of referring to regulating services. In this case, water, just looking at what does a healthy forest do in terms of regulating water. This is taken from up by Sierra Buttes, looking down towards Sardine Lake. Those of you that are familiar with that area, it's a really cool little micro basin where we can consider how water moves through the landscape and how a healthy forest regulates those services. So for example, rainstorm goes over this, precipitation hits this ridge here. A lot of that water is going to infiltrate into the soil, restore some of that groundwater. Some of it's going to run off into Upper Sardine. Some of it's then again get used by trees, and that use, I'll come back to that. Some of the water is going to evaporate from the lake surface, but then water use in trees is actually a passive process. So think of trees as basically straws moving water from the subsurface to the atmosphere. There's less moisture in the air than there is inside of a leaf. As dry air blows over a leaf, it pulls air through stomata, small pores on the leaf surface, and creates tension. So it's actually pulling water through the tree from the soil. It's an entirely passive process, often driven by how hot it is and how much moisture is in the soil. And this ratio of evaporation and then transpiration, which is how much water is coming out from trees, can be considered evapotranspiration. And this is a really important measure of forest health. So we're not just looking at how green are the trees, how diverse is the forest, but actually a really nice, succinct way of measuring forest health is how much water is moving through the landscape. That tells us how healthy the trees are they drought stressed, is there enough water in the soil, and are they still moving that water? And then another example of a regulating service is carbon. And this is something we need to consider at the scale of kind of the individual tree and the whole forest. And we'll come back to scale in a second, because all trees have this inherent trade-off between taking in carbon and losing water. So water is coming in through the roots, sometimes a little bit through the leaves itself, but primarily through the ground, being moved up through the tree. Carbon's brought into the leaves, shunted down throughout the tree, converted into sugars, which then get converted into wood. So this is all carbon being converted into a substance that can then build new tree material. And then if we zoom into that material, there's actually little individual cells that control how water is then moved through the tree. So all these things are connected, where a tree is taking in carbon, regulating the carbon cycle. If that tree dies, it'll actually then decay and send that carbon back to the forest floor. If it burns, it's losing that carbon back into the atmosphere. And so this then comes back to this question of scale. When we talk about forest health, and this applies at the kind of fire and fuels treatment scale as well, we need to consider what scale we're measuring things at. So this next couple of slides are talking about how we take certain measurements that feed into forest health, and then an example later of how these same types of measurements can feed into potentially mapping out treatments and why we might place certain treatments in certain locations. So when we talk about forest scale, we talk about individual trees. We talk about forest stands. A stand is a fairly arbitrary unit. It used to be defined as like a hip chain, basically, of an old forester inventory implement, but really it's just the definable edge of a certain forest type. It could be a plot that we're measuring. It could be where the pines stop in a certain area. And then there's the whole forest scale. That's kind of that larger ecosystem or landscape scale measurement. So I'm going to go over really quickly some of the tools we use to measure things at these scales, and then again, how they feed back into measuring things like fuel treatment efficacy and fire severity. So at the forest or ecosystem scale, there's a couple different ways that we make measurements. One is called flux tower, which is just literally building a tower. And at the top of that tower, there's this thing on the right called a sonic anemometer. And this is measuring how much air is moving in and out of a certain location. And it's calibrated to measure a couple acres of forest usually. And then there's sensors on the tips of these claws that are measuring things like carbon and water content and other materials in that parcel of air. And then you can quickly calculate at that forest scale how much carbon is coming in and out, how much water is coming in and out, get things like evapotranspiration, like we talked about earlier. You can then also either mount things on these towers or do flyovers with drones to then map individual trees using things like LiDAR. And so LiDAR is kind of as it sounds, it's like radar. Radar is radio detection and ranging. LiDAR is light detection and ranging. With LiDAR, we're either taking a plane or a drone and shining a laser and then basically detecting how quickly that laser comes back to a detector. And that can tell us how close an item is to the sensor. And then we can do that thousands of times and get a pretty awesome 3D map of the forest scale. This is an example of a high resolution LiDAR map of a portion of Central Park, for example. So we can use these to then dig in and say, where's there really dense canopy? Where's there less dense canopy? We can then use maps, overview LiDAR maps. And we have LiDAR data from our region where we can go in and say, hey, there's a really dense clump right here. There's a less dense clump right there. A fire burned through and it took out the dense clump. Or if we want to target treatments, can we look at calculating canopy density from this LiDAR data and say we want to reduce this to 30% canopy density. So it's a really powerful tool at a really high resolution where you can get down to the individual tree level. Then at the individual kind of forest stand scale, this is where oftentimes measurements are made by foresters, and this then feeds into treatment plans as well. We'll go out and measure things like tree diameters and then map trees. And you can get a plot map like this one in the top center. And what this is a plot map from the Southern Sierra again, where each circle is a tree. The diameter of the circle is the size of the tree. And what these are helpful for is then planning forest treatments based on both forest health and forest phase, and then where we might want to treat for different reasons. So if we look at this, we can see big, large individual trees up here with some gaps between them. Down here, we see a bunch of dots. So we have a high density of pole-sized trees. Maybe there'd be a treatment placed there. But overall, this plot's pretty open compared to one that would have, thousands of dots right here with a bunch of tiny individual trees. We did this at Hirschman's Pond prior to some treatments where we placed, for example, representative plots across the landscape. and then measured standardized forest inventory plots like this. And then we can look at the distribution of tree sizes. So this is on the bottom is diameter, larger trees on the right, more of those trees means a larger bar. And we can look at across the landscape, we had some areas that had a lot of pole-sized trees that probably needed some treatment. That area is either young, recovering from a stress, or highly invaded by shade-tolerant species. We then have a kind of mid-stage forest that might not need as much treatment. And then we have something like a mature forest, where we have a lot of larger individual spaced out trees that probably won't need any treatment at all. And again, the rule of thumb that I would apply to all of these things is when we have mature forests that might not need much treatment, no treatment is always going to be the best treatment. The more we disturb a landscape, the more we have a likelihood of introducing invasive species, inviting other pole-sized trees to then come in and recolonize. So there's a lot of ways we should look for what's the least amount of treatment we can do to then ensure we're getting to a forest health idea that we're trying to approach. Other things to consider at the stand scale with forest health are things like soil moisture. So we can go just take a probe, stick it in the ground and measure the water content in the soil, or get very complex and a little bit complicated and look at water through the entire soil profile by digging pits and placing sensors all the way down. This can tell us a lot about, is this plot, is this forest really resistant to drought because of the way water moves through it, or is it not? That can then feed back into, well, if it's resistant to drought, I'm much going to have a little bit more moisture if a fire comes through. Or if it has a shallower soil water profile, then maybe it's going to be less resistant to drought, deplete more quickly, and have drier fuels. And then finally, you said earlier, you mentioned talking about how we also look at forest resilience in terms of flora and fauna. We can also at the stand scale look at things like wildlife. So we can put out camera traps, do scat surveys, do actual live trapping, point counts and call surveys. And we always want to consider this when we consider forest health. The forest is more than just the trees. Then I just really wanted to talk about at the individual tree scale, some things you need to consider when implementing forest treatments are also the trees you select to remove if you're talking about fuels, and what that means for the health of the stand overall. And this is the scale that a lot of my background is in, is looking at, okay, what's going on at the individual needle level? Is this tree starting to shed needles? Are there signs of scale and other infections and pests in the tree? If we then take that needle and put under a microscope, what's going on cellularly in that tree? Is it healthy? Is it moving water and carbon effectively? I mentioned stomata earlier. That's these little pores on the leaf surface. And this is where carbon comes in and water comes out. And for all trees, this is an inherent trade-off. It's through the same hole. So they take carbon dioxide in through that hole, but water movement's a passive process being pulled out of the tree. So if that's true, and the tree is drought stressed, it might then want to close that pore to limit water loss. But if it does that, then it's taking in less carbon. And this can lead to things like carbon starvation. So there's this trade-off we need to consider with how all trees have different responses to drought stress and might then have a likelihood of future death depending on either how dry they are now or after treatment, if they're being exposed to more water or less water. These are all things we need to consider. If we then zoom in a little bit further into those cells that I mentioned earlier, these are called tracheids or xylem cells, and these are what make up annual tree rings. And these cells are called either xylem, phloem, or resin ducts. And this may be getting a little too specific, but just a little bit of background here. Xylem is what moves water up the tree. Phloem is what moves nutrients down the tree. And resin ducts are these big circles here, and these are what move resin throughout the tree. And these are really important for responding to stress, which I'll come back to in a second. These cells then are really important because they feed into how we know a lot about things like fire history and drought history, because they're the basis for tree rings. So tree rings are really near and dear to my heart. This is kind of where I cut my teeth in Sierra Nevada forest ecology, is using dendrochronology. Dendro meaning tree, chronology meaning time. So it's basically tree ring analysis. So we can do this to look back at things like fire history, when are fire scars occurring throughout the chronology of the tree. Because really the really cool part about a tree is every living tree in a temperate environment, seasonal environment like we have, is a living record of what it grew in, what it was exposed to. So in this tree on the right, we can look at, oh, it was growing really well. There was this tiny ring here, and then some thick rings after that. Maybe there was a stress applied there. It could have been a fire that didn't leave a fire scar. Could have been damage to the tree. We can look at patterns of small rings repeatedly, followed by a large ring. And we often call that competitive release. So we can see when a tree had a bunch of trees around it, maybe they all died for some reason, and then it was able to grow more because of access to new resources. So those patterns can tell us a lot about what did this forest experience prior to now, and how can that inform any management activities we want to do moving forward. How do we do this? Well, we take a little thing called an increment borer, go out, drill into a tree. A lot of people are always concerned about if this harms a tree. No, we keep it open because trees do the exact same thing that humans do with open wounds. They'll seal the wound with essentially resin, like a scab, like we do. And you can effectively remove 30% of a tree's xylem before it actually is going to die and cease function in terms of moving water. So it's pretty harmless to the tree unless it's stressed. So there are some trade-offs. We then take that core, put it in a little paper sheath, take it back to the lab, surface it, scan it in, and then use some pretty cool technological tools to measure tree ring widths at high resolution. And then the basic principle of dendrochronology is what's called cross-dating. So if we have a core that we sampled recently that goes back 100 years, someone else has a core that goes back 200 years from an older tree that was found. You can even do it with old beams within a log cabin, or petrified preserved wood underwater in lakes. This is happening at the Fallen Leaf Lake right now. And then we can find the patterns in those rings and overlap them to build a chronology that goes further and further back in time. And so far we've done this going pretty far back in time. There's a paleochronology that's publicly available, where we can look at climate data and things like stream flows going pretty far back in time to the tune of thousands of years. This is an example of how this is done to reconstruct, for example, the 2015 portion of that last mega drought that we had. This is looking at snow water equivalent. So more down on this graph means that there's less snowpack and water in that snowpack. And this is using a tree ring chronology where the red portion was taken from live trees, and then overlaying on a master chronology that goes back thousands of years to match everything up. And then they had a reconstructed snow water equivalent from that chronology. And we can see that 2015 was the most severe drought in about 500 years. And actually some more recent updates on this put it at the most severe drought in about 1200 years. Then going one step further into those individual cells, they tell us a lot about how a tree is moving water and how a tree is responding to something like fire in the ratio of early wood to late wood. So individual tree rings, we have these bands where we have light wood first and then dark wood later. The light wood is light because those individual cells are larger, because there's more water moving through them. As then they start to lose water later in the season, the cell walls thicken while the cells themselves shrink. And the reason this is you can think of this like putting a thin paper straw into a thick milkshake and sucking really hard. The straw can collapse. Or these cells also have small pores on the sides of them. If one happens to have air in it because it was dead, it was damaged, you can get air seeding and a bubble, which is basically embolism. It's the same exact mechanism as human embolism in the bloodstream. And so I won't go into too much of the details on this slide, but basically just to say that there's this, again, trade-off between thickening your walls, which is very carbon expensive, and moving water through the tree, which you need to stay alive. So this is called hydraulic safety. And this is really all just to show that when we're talking about treating forests, we go out and look at where's fire going to move through the landscape, what is a healthy forest at this scale. But we need to consider different things across all of these scales. So how much water is that forest moving? How dense is it? And this is kind of the scale that we're looking at with fire treatment. But then also, how are trees moving sap and nutrients? How is a tree growing over its life history? Is it a tree that's really resistant to stress or less resistant? If we know that, maybe we won't remove that tree when doing a treatment. How resistant is that tree to embolism and resisting severe drought? Maybe that can drive some of the patterns that we want to look for in the landscape. Obviously, this isn't necessarily viable to go check every single tree when we're going to implement a treatment. But again, it's just something to consider, is that we're not just looking at just how fire moves through the landscape, we're looking at overall resilience to all of these stressors and how we can use other sets of information to help guide that. So how do we use data like this? Well, for example, things like the Forest Inventory and Analysis Program, or FIA, is one of the most common publicly available and publicly used data sets for looking at forest density across the entire United States. In this program, they've been doing it since 1908. And there's basically a standardized protocol where they have plots placed across the entire US and they measure them at regular intervals. data sets like that, plus data we go get at smaller scales, can then be fed into approaches to forest management. So this is just an example, a recent one that maybe many of you are familiar with. I live up on the ridge right here, actually, so this was right in our backyard. This is the NMM Forest Restoration Project through Yuba Watershed Institute. And a lot of data went into basically placing these treatments in the most efficient way to say, we're trying to look at fuel abatement, but also forest health. So where can we place things like a prescribed burn or removing certain tree diameters, because we now have data saying how dense are those pockets of small trees and large trees. We can then use some of that individual scale data that I showed you earlier from an individual plot. If we take that same data and that bottom right figure, use that density distribution to guide treatments, we can maybe say something like, this upper one might need an understory thin or a burn because it's really dense with smaller trees. This middle one might need a little bit of treatment, and then the bottom one, maybe we can just do a large scale prescribed burn or no treatment at all. This then leads into kind of the final interpretation of threats to forest health at a larger scale, and just talking about what are some of the things that decreased forest health, again, in the context of fire, other things we need to consider, and then we'll come back and end on specifically fire and using some big fires from this year and past years to look at what we learned and how forest health interacts with those things. So what kinds of things decrease forest health? How do we know and how can we track them? And what are some potential mitigation strategies? So some common threats that we need to think about are obviously fire, and then drought, disease, management issues. Sometimes if we manage for fire, we could potentially introduce more problems than solutions. Encroachment, what I mean by that is the expansion of the wildland-urban interface in which we live. So building out into forested landscapes, it increases things like chance for ignition, increases likelihood of fire, as well as damages forest health. And all of this is under the umbrella of increasing temperatures, increasing aridity, decreasing precipitation. We'll talk about that in a second. And then all these things interact. So that's the main key here, is none of these things is the single driver. So I'm going to point that out right off the bat. You often hear people saying, oh, it's climate change, oh, it's forest mismanagement. It's never going to be a single thing. All of these things combine to increase likelihood of, you have dry fuels, increased fuel load, increasing aridity, longer fire season. All of those are from multiple factors. It's not going to be a single factor driving fire severity. This is a set of figures from a good friend and colleague of mine, Derek Young, who did a really cool paper. He's out at UC Davis looking at the 2012 through 16 drought and mapping mortality across the Sierra. This is taken from Forest Service data where they fly over the entire, basically all forested landscapes, and then map out a pretty high resolution where we have mass mortality. So the brown in this image means more dead trees. This is going back through 2009. I'm going to kind of show you a little animation through each year over time as we get into the drought. 2009 was a little dry, but pretty average. 10 was pretty average, but we actually had a lot of mortality in the northern portion of the Sierra. Don't necessarily know a cause. It's probably more of a biological cause. 2011 is one of the wettest years on record. And keep that in mind because even though the drought started in 2012, trees are then growing with the water they received in the winter of 2011, the water year of 2011. So there's still actually a lot less mortality going on. And note that our kind of anticipated background mortality is about 3%. We expect about 3% of trees in an area to die in a given year. 2013, you start seeing a little bit more yellow in the Sierra Nevada. 14, there's a big pocket in the south where we had some bark beetle outbreaks and trees that were weakened by drought. 15, it starts to expand. And then by 16 and ongoing, we had about 130 million standing dead trees. And this was a combination of drought and bark beetle induced. So this is just to show the scale at which some of these things need to be considered. When we're talking about forest treatment at a small scale, consider how that relates to mass mortality across the whole range and how those two things might interact. This led to then forests like the one that I showed you in the start. And then the image on the right is actually showing you an area that is now gone. Well, not gone, but burned at very high severity in the creek fire. And every tree in the background there is basically a dead tree all around. So there's a lot of standing dead dry fuel that they were working a little bit on some salvage, trying to also leave some there, which is a good thing ecologically. But then by the time this fire hit, it was just kind of a perfect storm of issues to get it going at a high severity. And I also pointed out this drought issue and bark beetle to again point out some of the various ecosystem services and how they're impacted by fire, by drought, and again, considering trade-offs in resistance to different traits. So for example, bark beetle, a lot of us are familiar with, attacks trees by burrowing in through the outside of a tree, carving out a nuptial chamber, laying its eggs. The larvae then crawl out, eat all the sugar-rich phloem of the tree, and effectively girdle the tree or cease water flow through the tree. Trees defend against that through resin ducts, which we talked about earlier. They build new resin ducts and shunt resin to where the beetle entered the tree and flood it out. So this is actually a beetle, bark beetle, captured inside some resin. This one was successful. The tree was successful, but oftentimes they're not. Now think back to when a tree is drought stressed, what I showed you earlier, the stomata, those pores. They're going to close those pores to limit water loss, but then they're decreasing carbon coming into the tree. Putting this resin out costs a lot of carbon, a lot of resources for the tree. And if they're already doing things like growing more roots, producing more cones, and then now they have a bark beetle coming in, or lots of bark beetle, during a dry year we get more, and they're drought stressed, then basically they're almost making decisions of, can I fight off this bark beetle? Can I continue to grow and outcompete trees around me? Can I grow thick bark, which is going to allow me to be fire resistant? So we have to consider these trade-offs between all of these different things trees are experiencing, and again, how that then plays out on the landscape in terms of treatment efficacy and how we might think about which trees we select to remove for certain levels of treatments. So this kind of then brings us all back to the main point here, which is fire. So I'm going to show you the same two images where Dixie's on the top left, very high severity over a large portion of the fire. Caldor, also very high severity over pretty significant portions of the fire, but also some low severity kind of underburn regions throughout. And what's interesting about these fires is we're really starting to see fire behavior that we have never expected before. So two fires in the same year, the Dixie and the Caldor, burned up to the crest, over the rocky granite Sierra crest, and down the far side. That was previously thought to be never a consideration, not possible. We would often look at if it's burning towards the crest, it's going to burn itself out. So at this point, I'm speaking to things here from an academic standpoint, but operationally, Cal Fire representatives have pointed out as well, they're throwing out their rule book. Some of these fires are not behaving the way that they're, quote, supposed to. These rules of thumb are gone, and now we're focused more on when we have a fire that builds up enough momentum, how do we get in front of it? How do we ensure that the forest is resilient? Because we're not actually going to get directly in its path and put it out. All we can do is steer it, like the Caldor fire, or plan ahead for these types of fires coming through. And so what I'm going to do now is use actually the Jones fire, which we, Sierra Streams Institute, had some unfortunate personal experience with, to talk about what we can learn from smaller fires and larger fires. So for those of you who aren't familiar, we, Sierra Streams Institute, had our office on the Woolman campus and actually lost our whole office to the Jones fire. We just now got back into a new office. We literally have been operating out of a new building for about 4 weeks now. And it's been a long road to recovery. But interestingly, the Jones fire, while we had some loss, was a really unique opportunity to learn about fire history and then what drove this fire, using some of these tools I've now outlined, like LiDAR and satellite imagery, and some of these really cool new approaches. What can we learn from the fire that, while we experienced loss from, is now a natural experiment? So here's the outline of the Jones fire, which I know many of you are familiar with. Now this is overlaid with the fire history of the region. And this is just showing that this area hasn't burned, in this case, in over 150 years. This fire history goes back to about 1878, so 150 years. And the Jones fire itself, the only portion of it that burned was a small finger as part of the 1988 49er fire. You can see the Lobo fire down here, just downstream of you guys. And basically there's large swaths right around Nevada City and Grass Valley that haven't quite burned at a larger scale in quite a long time. And so why does that matter when we think about forest health and fire and what we should be doing? Well, we can look at something called the fire return interval. So using that Dendrochronology tool that we talked about earlier, we can piece together fire history in a region. This is using fire scars, as well as other written data sources, verbal data sources from indigenous groups, but primarily fire scars and tree rings, to piece together across the whole Sierra and in particular regions, how often certain landscapes burn, going back thousands of years. In this case, we think that the two dominant landscapes that we have here, dry mixed conifer and oak woodland, burned every 2 to 50 years, with a median return interval of 9 to 12 years. So that means that for the most part, every sampled area across the Sierra where tree cores were taken, that we should expect that landscape to burn about every decade at lower severities, not at this high severity that we're seeing now, but kind of these smaller scale fires. So if we look back at this fire history map, that means we have a fire debt built into this landscape of 10 to more than 100 years. And this then brings up that discussion of things like forest management versus climate. Well, it's kind of a combination of things, because if we have an area that wasn't burned in over 100 years, but used to burn every 10 years, then it's overdue for a burn unless we're out there manually managing it. And that's the other consideration as part of this map. There's a lot of homes in this area now, lots of treatments that have been done. So it's not to say that this fire debt means every unburned region needs to burn or will burn, just that there's a debt at that landscape scale. Coupled with that, changes in climate. So this is actually observed at shorter scales, increasing temperatures and aridity at the scale of, in this case, like 30-meter resolution, so pretty high resolution, across the entire state of California, going back to, in this case, 1906. And what you have on the top figures is mean temperature, where red is warming up over the last 100 years, minimum temperature warming up over the last 100 years, max temperature is actually cooled in the majority of the state. This is an important consideration because really the trend that we're seeing is our cooler temperatures are getting warmer, whereas our warmer temperatures are getting slightly cooler. So what's driving the increase in temperature is less cool periods. Precipitation, more blue is more precipitation. We actually see across most of the state, it's actually increasing. But in the Sierra, it's staying pretty average or decreasing depending on where you are. This then leads to interpretations of evapotranspiration, that water movement measure I talked about earlier. Across most of the state where it's red, it's increasing. Southern portion, it's decreasing. More red means more aridity. There's more water being pulled out of the landscape to the atmosphere. Combine all of this and it feeds into a measure called climatic water deficit, which is just a useful measure of drought. And it's basically, as it sounds, deficit in millimeters of water. It's kind of like that fire debt. In this case, it's water debt. How much water is missing from the landscape that's being pulled out? And if we look at the Sierra Nevada, it's primarily in these foothill regions where we have increasing aridity over the last 100 years. This then leads to models of fire likelihood moving forward. This is a model from who's considered one of the kind of foremost fire modelers at this point, Leroy Westerling, down at UC Merced. He's the one that actually develops models for the insurance commissioner of the state, as well as some others, to look at fire likelihood. This is an older model. We're looking at the likelihood of large fires, which I think is really telling. Large fires in this paper were quantified at 500 acres or larger. Obviously, at this point, 500 acres is actually a pretty good small fire with some of the ways that they're burning and our ability to get control of them. Looking out into 27 to 2099, the lower range of our best climate models expects an 11% increase in those fires. So going up no matter what, because remember those lowest range climate models are actually even decreasing aridity in some cases. Whereas under the most extreme cases, we expect a 55% increase in these large wildfires across the landscape. So this then leads finally into that discussion of defining good versus bad fires and then how we can manage for those. I just want to point out that I put good and bad in quotes here because these are really subjective terms. One thing we need to consider with forest health, fuel treatment, and fire severity is it's really defined by the stakeholders. We can talk about things ecologically. We can talk about things from a timber perspective. We can talk about things from a wildlife perspective. They're all going to have different responses to different severities of fire. But for the most part, the kind of general rule of thumb is when we see a fire where we see a large degree of torching, like on the fire on the right, and high severity runs or crown fire, where we get fire carried up into the tops of all of the tallest trees that wipe out all of those trees, that's likely to be more of a bad fire, not just because of the loss of that canopy, but when you get a high severity enough fire, you're scorching the soil to the point where there's no more organic material. It can't recover very well. If you go look at portions of the North Complex, which I'll show you a map of in a second, it's just scorched moonscape and probably not coming back. It's going to convert to more of a shrubby landscape now, which then increases likelihood of future high severity fire again. There's kind of a cycle there. Whereas with lower severity fire, like the one on the left, in this case, it's just a prescribed burn, we expect things to creep along. And again, that every 10-year fire severity of just clearing things out and actually opening up the floor to then let things like ponderosa pine and oak resprout, regerminate, and do well. So then, again, returning to the Jones Fire as an example of, well, what did we learn from the Jones Fire? So using some of those high resolution kind of forest scale tools, In this case, we're looking at burn severity and the top left figure of the Jones Fire. This was taken using satellite imagery, remote sensing data, using what's called the normalized burn ratio. Normalized burn ratio is taking. Oh, a question? Okay. So normalized burn ratio is taking satellite data using reflectance. So it's looking at the wavelength of light that's reflected back to a sensor. And that can tell us a lot about the green vegetation cover change. Is there ash on the forest floor? And those kinds of things. And we take a value before the fire and after. So it's a different normalized burn ratio. And that allows us to then map burn severity. And really what I want to point out about the Jones Fire is while we lost our office in it in a high severity pocket, this is the distribution of fire severity on the right. The severity is pretty arbitrary, but the scale is essentially -200 to 1200. It's kind of a weird number. And most of this is what we call moderate severity. So it's in the middle zone here, less than half of that. When we start getting above, the 600 to 800 values is when we start getting into high severity. For comparison, we'll look at the Increment Borer, the North Complex, as it's called also, just north of us, from last year as well. You can see the Jones Fire down here for scale. And you can see the values here. We had a couple pockets of 1,000 in the Jones Fire. We had all the way up to 1,600, which is actually off the scale, so some of that needs to be dropped off from the North Complex. But looking at the distribution here, the majority of it was either in this moderate severity, which is good, kind of an arbitrary term, but mixed severity. And then we had a large portion in high severity. And if you go look through some of those areas, that's where you have that landscape. So just showing again that consider fire damage and fire impacts relative to other fires. But then what can we learn from the Jones Fire in terms of what worked and what didn't? So what actually drove fire severity, and can we use that to plan treatments? So using other versions of these reflectance tools, we can look at things like canopy cover. This is just from the top down, how dense is the forest, how covered is it at a higher level, so that kind of conifer tops of the trees level. This is looking at canopy cover in 2019, canopy cover in 2020. And then what we can do over multiple years is look for signals of certain areas across the landscape that changed. So for example, both of these areas had decreases in canopy cover or increases in certain portions. So we can look at then, right now we're working with some of the community members in this community to say, anecdotally, where did you treat on your parcels? And can we then see that at this map scale and map where treatments were 5 years back, 10 years back, 2 years ago, last year, and start to pick out where those treatments were on this map of canopy cover, and then build a map of canopy change pre and post fire. And then we can go into individual pixels on this map, which is a 10-meter scale. So it's about a large tree, and look at what's the change in canopy cover between that pixel and every other pixel on the map. And that gives us a value of what we call structural heterogeneity. And the higher the value here, the more broken up that vegetation is. So this is really important when we talk about things like clumpiness or uniformity. So we're looking at, is one area of the landscape really densely covered just as much as the one next to it, or are there breaks in that vegetation? We can then plug all of that into a model of burn severity and say which of these was the predominant driver of burn severity. Quick note is that this was a preliminary analysis, and I'm sure many of you are pointing out, things like wind, topography, all of those are hugely significant drivers, and those are kind of considered background covariates in this case, so they weren't included in this model. This is just looking at, out of these three, which ones were the dominant drivers. And really what we're seeing is the higher the number in this bottom row, the higher the driver of severity, and we see negative value for structural heterogeneity, positive value for cover. So it makes sense. It's basically saying where you have a dense forest, but then also where you have a forest that is equally dense across the landscape, you're going to have high severity. So it's just saying where you have a more breaking up of that forest, you have lower severity. So that then feeds back into this idea of, well, what is a resilient forest? Well, a resilient forest might be a heterogeneous one. It might be one that's broken up as opposed to just uniformly treated. So on this resilience plot, we can think of the Jones Fire as still being kind of in this portion of the landscape, or this portion of this plot. It's after the fire, it's just now recovering. We don't know which of these two resilience figures it's going to more closely represent, but it's still in that recovery phase. We still have a lot to learn from it. This then goes into, well, how do we then account for this in management? Well, when we think of management, we think of basically different ways that we can try to mimic natural processes on the landscape. And really, again, I want to come back to this idea that we shouldn't be trying to prevent fire. We should actually be looking at trying to minimize severity. If we prevent fire, fire is going to hit it at some point. If we minimize severity, fire is allowed to do its ecological role while also not threatening structures and human life and all of those important things. So management activities can consider, well, if we burn an experimental plot or if one burned in a natural fire, what did it do? What was the forest like before the burn? And then how did that influence the burn? So can we act similarly to then what the forest looks like after the burn to guide what we should do before a burn? I'm going to skip this really quick, actually, and just get to pushing time a little bit. Just really wanted to push into what we can then also learn from some of these mega fires from this year, and last year. A lot of the data is still coming out of some of these larger fires, but really I want to point out that the Dixie Fire, the Caldor Fire, the Bootleg Fire up in Oregon are really interesting natural experiments because, like I said, if fire behavior is changing, where we think of fuel treatments at the scale of something like the Jones Fire, where it only has enough time to build up momentum to make some runs up some areas, but mostly it gets pretty boxed in. Worth pointing out that having the Cal Fire air station here, that Jones Fire set a record for the amount of retardant dropped on a fire. So we have different controls here than we might have in other forested landscapes. But we need to think of both those small fires, but also these landscape scale fires we're seeing more and more of. When we think of forest treatment relative to the Caldor or the Dixie, a lot of the data that's coming out is, did the fuel break or forest treatment reduce fire severity or reduce fire spread? It probably reduced a little bit of fire spread or increased resilience. Did it reduce, reduced fire severity and resilience, but did it reduce spread? Not at all. And that's really a key point that we all need to be really realistic about, is if we have these landscape scale fires in our region, treatments aren't going to stop that. The treatments are put in place to increase evacuation, to increase resilience, and to increase basically the resilience of your home in terms of defensible space, and allowing it to be protected and allow the forest to recover after the fire. It's not preventing its movement. The Bootleg Fire is an interesting example of this, and some data is coming out of the two California large fires that are pointing to the same thing. And this is an interesting dichotomy of these two articles about the bootleg before the data is coming out. One group said, did forest management play a role? We looked at maps of fire spread across the landscape, and we have some areas there's been some experimental treatments done over many years, and found that actually fire spread wasn't really reduced in that area. So therefore the forest management was a failure. Another group in that same exact forest, so I want to point out down here, it's the Sycan Marsh Preserve, also says it did what it was supposed to do. And the reason they're saying it did what it was supposed to do is firefighters in that region pointed out, if there was heterogeneity in the landscape around those clumps of trees, a big enough gap, and the understory was treated, the fire actually dropped out of the crowns into the understory, burned just as fast, was still a threat, but was not that high severity crown fire that is really the damaging fire. So it's two different approaches to the same understanding of fire severity and its impacts. And this finally kind of leads to this idea of forest restoration and fuels reduction. They're not always the same thing, but they can be. This is a really important consideration. This is a paper from Scott Stevens, who's considered by many to be kind of one of the fathers of modern fire ecology. This is just a model, and I want to point off right off the bat, as many of us point out in the sciences and in general, a model is kind of our best case understanding of a synthetic made up system, and we're still collecting real data in the real world to see if this plays out. But they ran some models based on some real data where they were able to use fire modeling software to ignite made up plots and see how fire moves across the landscape. They took some real data, so these are those forest plots like I showed you earlier, every circle is a tree, ignited a fire at the bottom portion, and then let it kind of burn through many simulations across the plot. On the left, we have the pre-treated plot. Pre-treatment, so nothing treated. In the middle, we actually have the fuel hazard reduction. And the key thing here is when we talk about fuel reduction, this often is the approach for fuel breaks. I want to point out, it's not necessarily a bad thing or a good thing, but this is when we're just treating ladder fuels because we're concerned about fire movement into the landscape or across it. On the right, we have what's considered a forest restoration treatment. This is where they actually cleared out whole clumps of large trees left some small trees, and basically took that heterogeneity approach. The fire movement across the landscape, simulation after simulation showed that in the just fuel hazard reduction treatment, it moved pretty uniformly across the entire area and burned at moderate to high severity across the entire plot. If we go on the restoration plot, yes, it burned at high severity, that's the red, in these clumps of small trees, but then when it hit the gaps, it either stopped entirely, burned out, dropped out of the canopy, and kind of just burned more abnormally, kind of more heterogeneically again through the landscape. So this again points to, depends on what your goals are with forest treatment, but that we might expect that just treating understory and ladder fuels might not be the way to go if we're just looking at fire movement and things like fire severity. If we're looking at overall forest health, we might want to consider clumpiness and introducing natural variability into the landscape. And then just wanted to kind of end on the other projects in the area that I was just referring to earlier. So we, Sierra Streams Institute, are kind of fiscally sponsoring and guiding some work in the Jones Fire Scar as part of the Sierra Foothill Forest Climate Resilience Project funded by the Wildlife Conservation Board. This ironically was an effort that started before the Jones Fire, and then the funding came through after the Jones Fire. So it was really unfortunate, but in a scientifically useful way, also interesting and timely to say, what did we learn from the Jones Fire? And then how could we then apply that to the landscape? These are the parcels included in the project. We have the Jones Bar Firewise community, as well as some BLM plots in there, the Nevada State School of the Arts. I should point out one of these parcels is no longer included in the project, and then the Shady Creek Outdoor School. And this is because we have a partner project, as also part of Sierra Streams Institute, that's working on forest health curriculum and how we measure things like fuel load with 3rd through 5th graders. It just launched this weekend, actually. And those students are then collecting data that then feeds back into the management plans of these schools. And then those protocols are then feeding back into the Firewise community to help them measure these things on their own parcels, to then move forward with an implementation project with them. They currently have already made progress toward developing their own fuel break idea. And then I've been working with them, giving this presentation, the same one that you just saw, to them to talk about alternative approaches. Again, fuel break is not a bad approach at all. We just need to consider how might a fire move through the landscape and where would we place either a fuel break or other types of treatments to get the best bang for our buck in terms of our treatment approach. And so I really wanted to share this with you guys because your project is down in this region here. And so really we're kind of partners on the landscape. And we really need to consider, if we have these larger landscape fires, these landscape scale fires, how can we ensure that our treatments are distributed across the landscape and not just in single areas where if it burns past that treatment, really at that landscape scale, it might not be effective anymore. But how do we all work together to keep track of what's happening? That's where your guys' project is. And then just a quick plug for the Yuba Forest Network Stakeholder Mapping Project. If you guys look up the Yuba Forest Network, Circle has done a really great job of funding some collaborative data sharing approaches to look at what are all the different projects happening in the region. And this really gives us a nice snapshot to say, how can we link all of these together? So for example, this big purple blob here is our WCB project. This is another private CFIP project, the Forestry Improvement Program. Your project is in this region. There's the Ponderosa West fuel break. I know there's another fuel break being planned over here somewhere. So really just looking at where they all are and how do we link together? How do we consider that landscape scale, maybe even modeling how fire might move across the landscape, use what we learned from the Jones Fire or from these larger fires to really try to plan what's the best bang for our buck. So for example, we have the Yuba Watershed Institute as a project in here and one up here. Sierra Streams Institute, we're working on some parcels up here as well as down here. So there's work going on all over, but if they're individual parcel scale projects, they might not really matter at that landscape fire scale. We need to think about linking those together and how fire is going to transfer from parcel to parcel. That can then allow us to consider how do we build in resilience to that fire stress, so we're not just focused on resistance, we're actually focused on overall resilience, including recovery. So I always like ending on this slide because really it's more of, to me, the scientific approach and data-driven approach to forest management is, this quote from Einstein. It says, if I have an hour to solve a problem, my life depended on the solution, I would use the first 55 minutes to determine the proper questions to ask. And really what this year and the past year and recent years are showing us is that we still have a lot more questions to ask. We don't fully understand fire behavior the way that we thought we did, especially in this kind of unfortunately new normal, this new era of these landscape scale fires. And we're struggling to catch up to them in terms of forest treatment. So really it's a matter of if not when, and can we think of how can we best approach that and consider that with our field treatment strategies. So with that, should I just stop sharing the screen maybe for any questions? Or leave it up in case people want to view any particular slide?